The courthouse was buzzing long before the hearing began. Reporters shuffled in with their notepads. Photographers prepared their lenses. And curious townspeople pressed against the walls just to catch a glimpse of the trial everyone had been talking about for weeks. This was no ordinary case. It carried with it the weight of injustice, the cries of a child, and the determination of a community desperate for the truth to surface. At the center of it all was a little girl. She was no older than 9, her small frame almost swallowed by the oversized wooden chair she was led to. Her blonde hair was tied back in a loose braid, though a few strands had slipped free, framing a pale, anxious face. In her hand, she clutched a teddy bear, so tightly its fur was pressed flat. The courtroom fell silent as she entered, the echo of her shoes tapping against the marble floor, sounding far too loud for such a delicate presence. The judge, an older man with silver hair and a stern face, adjusted his glasses as his gaze softened on the child. He was accustomed to hardened criminals, heated debates, and relentless lawyers. But a trembling child standing before him, tasked with carrying the weight of truth, was something that pierced even his seasoned heart. The atmosphere was tense, heavy with anticipation. The defense sat stiffly, whispering strategies to one another, their client the accused leaning back with an expression that wavered between arrogance and unease. The prosecution, on the other side, held folders packed with evidence, but knew their most crucial piece wasn't paper or photographs. It was this child, sitting nervously with wide, fearful eyes. What caught the crowd most off guard, however, was not the little girl herself. It was the presence of a large German shepherd sitting calmly near the witness stand. The dog wore a simple harness that read, "Comfort Canine." His eyes, warm and steady, seemed to survey the room with quiet authority. He wasn't there to attack or intimidate. He was there for something unusual in the justice system: emotional support. Some whispered in confusion. Why was there a dog in court? Others nodded knowingly. The town had heard that the child had been too terrified to speak during early questioning, her trauma silencing her voice. It was only after meeting the specially trained police dog that she found the courage to even consider stepping into the courtroom. The judge lifted his gavel slightly and tapped it against the block. "Order in the court," he said firmly, though the room was already silent. His eyes rested on the child. "You're safe here. Just take your time." But time felt heavier than anything else in that moment. The little girl's eyes darted across the room, catching sight of strangers staring at her, their faces a blur of curiosity, sympathy, or judgment. Her gaze landed briefly on the accused. The man's cold, steady eyes made her grip the teddy bear tighter, her body stiffening as if bracing for a storm. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people whispered, pitying her. Others doubted if she could manage. A few even questioned whether placing a child in such a position was ethical. But the judge's decision had been clear. Her testimony was essential. She had seen something no one else had, and without her voice, the case would falter. The bailiff shifted slightly, his hand brushing the leash of the German shepherd, who remained unbothered by the tension. The dog's ears flicked once, his gaze moving to the little girl, and somehow, that simple look felt like reassurance. It was as if the animal knew exactly how heavy her burden was. The prosecution lawyer, a woman with kind eyes, leaned forward and spoke softly. "Sweetheart, can you tell us your name?" The child opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her lips moved soundlessly, her throat tight. The microphone in front of her amplified only her silence. The audience held its breath. For a long moment, the room was frozen. The judge shifted uncomfortably. The defense smirked slightly, and the girl's mother, sitting in the front row, pressed her hands together in a silent prayer. Finally, a faint whisper escaped. "Emily." The room collectively exhaled. It wasn't much, but it was something. A single word had broken through the wall of fear. The lawyer smiled warmly. "Thank you, Emily. That was very brave." But bravery was fleeting when fear returned with the next question. "Emily, can you tell us why you're here today?" Her eyes widened, tears brimming instantly. She shook her head, pulling the teddy bear close. Her lips pressed tight, her voice lost again. A hush fell over the crowd as hope wavered. The defense lawyer leaned back smugly, already believing the child would collapse under pressure. And then, something subtle but remarkable happened. The police dog shifted closer. He didn't bark, didn't tug his leash, didn't make a sound. He simply placed himself beside her chair, his head rising to rest gently against the edge of the witness stand. Emily's eyes fell on him. Her trembling fingers slowly stretched out, brushing against his fur. His coat was warm, steady, alive. For the first time since she walked in, she wasn't staring at strangers or the accused. She was staring into eyes that offered nothing but silent comfort. The room noticed the change immediately. Her shoulders dropped slightly, her breathing steadied. The teddy bear in one hand, the dog's fur in the other, she seemed to draw strength from the unlikely companion by her side. The judge leaned forward, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Perhaps this unusual decision to allow the dog had not been a mistake after all. The prosecution spoke again, this time gentler than before. "Emily, you don't have to be afraid. You're safe now. We're all here to listen to you." Emily blinked, her small voice barely above a whisper. "I know." It wasn't much, but it was enough to send ripples through the courtroom. She had spoken again. Her voice existed, it wasn't broken, only hidden beneath the weight of fear. The accused shifted uncomfortably for the first time, his confident smirk faltering. The dog didn't move, his gaze fixed on Emily like a guardian unwilling to leave her side. The moment felt suspended in time. No one dared breathe too loudly, afraid to break whatever fragile courage had begun to bloom inside the girl. The audience wasn't just watching a trial, they were witnessing the beginning of something extraordinary. And so, part one ended not with a loud revelation, not with fireworks or sudden confessions, but with something far more powerful, the trembling whisper of a child who had found her first flicker of courage. The faint whisper of Emily's name had settled into the courtroom like the softest echo of hope. Yet, even as the audience leaned in, silently urging her onward, fear clung to the little girl like a shadow. Her small fingers trembled on the teddy bear, squeezing it so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. Though the police dog sat quietly at her side, his calm presence grounding her, the battle inside her heart was far from over. The prosecutor, recognizing the fragile line between bravery and collapse, softened her tone even more. "Emily," she said gently, "you're very brave for being here. Could you tell us, in your own words, what happened that day?" The girl's eyes flickered across the courtroom, landing for a second too long on the accused. He sat only feet away, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes, cold, dark, unflinching, burned into her small frame like daggers. That single look was enough to drag Emily back to the terrifying memory of that night. Her breath quickened, her chest rising and falling with the speed of someone trapped in panic. The courtroom blurred. The walls seemed to close in. She shook her head violently, whispering a single trembling word. "No," the prosecution faltered. The defense seized the moment like a vulture, spotting weakness. The defense lawyer, a man with a sharp jawline and an even sharper tongue, stood up slowly, straightening his tie before addressing the court. "Your Honor," he said with mock patience, "it seems clear that the child is unable to testify. This hesitation only proves her testimony will be unreliable. Surely, we cannot build a case upon the trembling memory of a frightened little girl." Gasps rippled through the room. Emily's mother's eyes widened in outrage, but she kept her composure, knowing outbursts wouldn't help. The judge held up a hand to quiet the whispers. His gaze, however, lingered on Emily, who now had her face buried into the dog's fur, as though trying to vanish entirely. For Emily, the lawyer's words weren't just arguments. They were knives cutting into her already fragile courage. She felt the courtroom's judgment, the weight of dozens of eyes, the suffocating expectation that she had to relive the worst moment of her life in front of strangers. Every instinct inside her screamed to run, to flee the courtroom, to escape those eyes forever. Her throat tightened as tears slid silently down her cheeks. She was not a witness in her own mind. She was just a little girl who wanted to be anywhere but here. The prosecutor, refusing to give up, knelt slightly to meet Emily's eyes at her level. "Emily," she whispered, her voice carrying only to the front rows, "I know you're scared. But look around. Do you see anyone here who can hurt you right now?" Emily sniffled, daring to lift her head. She scanned the courtroom slowly. Her mother sat only feet away, her face filled with encouragement. The bailiff stood nearby, his hand never far from his holster. The judge, though stern, gave her a nod that felt almost like reassurance. And then, finally, she looked at the police dog. The animal hadn't moved an inch, his dark eyes steady, unwavering, as though silently saying, "You're not alone. Not here, not ever." Emily drew in a shaky breath. But when her eyes accidentally met the accused's again, her courage faltered. His face was expressionless, but she remembered his voice, the threat, the fear that had gripped her that night. Her entire body stiffened, and suddenly the courtroom vanished from her mind. She was back in that place where the shadows were long, and safety was nowhere to be found. The flashbacks were sharp, vivid. She heard his footsteps, saw the glint of something in his hand, felt the overwhelming terror of being small and powerless. Her hand gripped the dog's fur desperately, anchoring herself to the present. The prosecutor saw the panic flooding her face and realized what was happening. "Emily," she said firmly, cutting through the fog, "look at me. Just me. Don't look at anyone else. Just me." Emily's wide eyes locked on the lawyer, clinging to the lifeline offered. The prosecutor gave her a small smile. "I believe you. Everyone here believes you. We just need your voice. Can you give us just a little bit of your voice?" The courtroom sat frozen, waiting for the answer. Emily hesitated, her lips trembling. For a moment, silence hung so heavy, it seemed the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then finally, in a voice so small that the microphone had to catch it for others to hear, she whispered, "I saw him." The words were like a spark in the dark. Gasps echoed throughout the room. The defense lawyer's smirk faltered, the prosecution's eyes lit up, and the judge leaned forward in his chair. Emily's voice was faint, fragile, but it existed. She had spoken. The defense immediately stood, his voice sharp. "Objection, Your Honor. This is nothing but emotional manipulation. A child's frightened memory cannot be considered reliable testimony." But no one was listening to him, not really. Their eyes were fixed on the girl, who, despite trembling violently, had managed to force out words that carried the weight of truth. She felt exhausted from saying just those 3 words. Her chest heaved as though she had run miles. But the dog pressed closer to her side, and she rested her hand on his back, her tiny fingers twisting into his thick fur. The warmth grounded her. She wasn't alone. The prosecutor smiled gently, resisting the urge to cheer at the breakthrough. "Emily," she said softly, "that was very brave. You did so well. Can you tell us what you saw him do?" Emily's lips parted, but fear stopped her again. She couldn't yet bring herself to speak more. Not now. Not while the memories clawed at her like shadows reaching from the past. The judge, sensing her breaking point, intervened. "That will be enough for today. We will allow the witness a short recess." A collective sigh swept through the room, tension easing slightly. The defense grumbled under his breath, but the judge silenced him with a glare. As Emily was led away from the stand, the dog walking faithfully beside her, every eye in the courtroom followed. Some eyes were skeptical, others sympathetic, but most were filled with admiration. They had just witnessed a child, broken by fear, still managed to summon enough strength to say the words that no one else could. Her mother rushed to her side, hugging her tightly. Emily clung to her mother with one arm, the teddy bear still in her grasp, while her other hand refused to let go of the dog's fur. And though her testimony was far from complete, the room knew one thing. A spark had been lit. Fear still gripped her heart, but courage had made its first appearance. And in that moment, everyone realized they hadn't seen the last of Emily's voice. When the recess ended, the courtroom filled once more with murmurs and hushed anticipation. Reporters scribbled furiously, lawyers adjusted their notes, and curious spectators leaned forward, hoping for the next chapter in what was quickly becoming one of the most gripping testimonies the town had ever seen. Emily, however, wasn't thinking about the audience. She was thinking about the way her stomach felt, as though it had dropped to the floor, the way her knees wobbled every time she glanced toward the accused. She thought of the words she had whispered before, "I saw him," and how they had left her both proud and completely drained. Her mother knelt in front of her during the break, brushing strands of hair from her damp forehead. "You're doing so well, sweetheart," she whispered. So well. "You're the bravest girl I know." But Emily didn't feel brave. She felt tiny, like the teddy bear in her hands was her only shield against a world that demanded too much. She wanted to hide under a blanket, not sit under glaring lights while strangers asked her impossible questions. Then she felt a nudge. Warm, steady, and surprisingly gentle. The police dog, his name was Justice, she had learned earlier, leaned his head against her knee. His dark eyes met hers, not with pity, not with demand, but with something far more grounding, calm. He didn't ask her to speak, didn't expect her to be strong. He just was. Emily's trembling fingers moved to his fur again, tangling themselves into the thick coat. She leaned down, pressing her cheek against him, breathing in the comforting scent of warmth and safety. For the first time since arriving at the courthouse, her shoulders eased, the tightness in her chest loosening ever so slightly. When the bailiff announced it was time to return, Emily stood on shaky legs. Justice walked beside her, his large frame a silent wall of protection. With every step, she felt just a little stronger. The moment she re-entered the courtroom, the crowd hushed again. Everyone noticed the way the dog stayed close, the way Emily's hand remained steady in his fur. It wasn't just a child entering anymore. It was a pair, bonded in a way that seemed unshakable. The judge watched carefully. Though some in the legal field had criticized the decision to allow a dog in court, he couldn't deny what he was seeing. The child who had been on the brink of collapse was now breathing more evenly, her eyes no longer darting wildly. The dog wasn't just a comfort, he was a bridge between silence and courage. The prosecution smiled warmly as Emily took her seat again. "Welcome back, Emily," she said softly. "How are you feeling?" Emily's eyes flicked toward Justice, who had lowered himself to the floor beside her chair. She stroked his back once before answering. "Better," she whispered. A ripple of astonishment moved through the audience. The single word wasn't loud, but it was clearer, steadier than before. The defense lawyer frowned, tapping his pen against the table. He leaned toward his client, whispering something, then leaned back with a smirk that suggested he thought this newfound courage wouldn't last long. The prosecutor continued, "You're very brave. Can you tell us what helps you feel safe right now?" Emily didn't hesitate this time. She pointed at the dog. "Him. A collective awe rose from the spectators before the judge's gavel brought order again. Still, even he couldn't hide the flicker of a smile tugging at his lips. The prosecutor nodded. "And as long as he's here, do you think you can try to tell us what you remember?" Emily swallowed hard, looking at Justice again. His ears twitched, but he didn't move. He simply stayed steady, patient, unbothered by the tension of the room. Emily's small hand tightened in his fur, and slowly she nodded. The first words came haltingly, like stepping stones across a rushing river. I saw him that night," she said, her voice trembling but audible. "I remember because he looked at me, just like he's looking now." The audience shifted, heads turning toward the accused. He tried to mask his discomfort, but the tightening of his jaw was impossible to miss. Emily took another shaky breath. Justice pressed his head lightly against her leg, grounding her again. With that, her voice grew steadier. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I thought if I stayed quiet, maybe it would go away. But it didn't." Her eyes began to water, but she didn't look away this time. She kept stroking the dog's fur, her words slowly weaving into something stronger. He hurt people. I saw it, and I thought he would hurt me too. But I can't stay quiet anymore. Because it's the truth." The room went silent. Even the clicking of reporters' pens stopped for a moment. The defense lawyer quickly stood, attempting to interrupt. "Objection, Your Honor. This is leading testimony and—" "Overruled," the judge said firmly, cutting him off. His gaze never left the little girl. Emily blinked through her tears, her voice still trembling. "I don't want him to hurt anyone else." The courtroom sat spellbound. Here was a child who had arrived nearly mute, consumed by fear, now finding her voice with the help of a four-legged companion. The prosecutor smiled softly, lowering her voice as if she didn't want to scare the courage away. "Emily, you're doing so well. You've helped us understand so much already. You're not alone here, okay?" Emily looked down at Justice again. His tail wagged once, slowly, almost as if he understood. She allowed herself a tiny smile, brushing her cheek against his head before whispering, "Okay." For the rest of that day's session, she didn't collapse into silence again. Whenever fear surged, she reached for the dog. Whenever her voice wavered, she glanced at him. And each time, she found just enough strength to continue. By the time the judge called for adjournment, Emily had said more than anyone expected. Not the full story, yet not all of it, but enough to make the accused sweat, enough to make the defense falter, and enough to remind everyone that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it comes in whispers, carried on the shoulders of an unlikely friend. As the bailiff led Emily out of the courtroom, Justice walking faithfully at her side, the audience rose to their feet. Not because the trial had ended for the day, but because they had just witnessed something extraordinary. For the first time in weeks, Emily no longer looked like just a scared little girl. She looked like someone who had found a piece of her voice. And the whole courtroom knew they owed that to the quiet, loyal strength of a dog named Justice. The courtroom was buzzing after Emily's breakthrough the previous day. News had spread beyond the courthouse, carried by reporters who scribbled furiously as soon as she whispered her first clear words. "I saw him." Just 3 words, but they had electrified the town. By the time the next session began, the courtroom was packed tighter than before. People had skipped work, traveled from nearby counties, even camped overnight outside the courthouse, all to witness the child's testimony. Television cameras lined the street. Inside, every bench overflowed with spectators, eager for more. But none of that mattered to Emily. For her, walking back into the courtroom felt like stepping into a storm. Her hands clutched her teddy bear, her lips pressed tight and her legs moved cautiously, one step at a time. At her side, as always, was Justice. The big German shepherd padded calmly beside her, his gait steady, his gaze focused ahead. Emily reached down to touch his fur with every step, as if confirming he was still there. The murmurs of the crowd softened into silence as the pair entered. All eyes followed them, but Emily didn't shrink as much this time. She still felt small, still felt the weight of dozens of stares, but she also knew she wasn't alone. Justice's silent companionship carried her across the room until she climbed into the witness chair. The judge gave her a nod. "Welcome back, Emily," he said gently, his stern voice softened in her presence. "Are you ready to continue?" Emily's lips moved slightly before a faint whisper escaped. "Yes." The prosecution smiled warmly. She had prepared carefully, knowing the wrong question could shatter Emily's fragile courage. "Emily," she began, "yesterday you told us something very important. You said you saw him that night. Do you remember?" Emily nodded slowly. Her fingers curled deeper into Justice's fur. "Would you like to tell us a little more about what you saw?" The courtroom leaned forward, as though pulled by invisible strings. Every breath seemed to pause. Emily's eyes flicked toward the accused, and fear rushed back like a wave. His presence was still heavy, his stare sharp, but Emily quickly looked down at the dog instead. Justice didn't move. He didn't blink. His quiet, patient strength seemed to say, "You can do this." Her lips parted, and this time, words emerged, not a whisper, but a fragile voice that carried through the microphone. "I saw him hurt someone." The audience gasped. The judge tapped his gavel once. "Order." Emily swallowed, her voice trembling but steady enough to continue. "I was hiding. I didn't think he saw me, but he looked at me, and I was so scared." Her little hands clutched the teddy bear, but she didn't stop. With each word, her grip on Justice's fur grew firmer, as though the dog's stillness was feeding her courage. The prosecutor spoke softly, guiding her. "Emily, you're doing so well. Can you tell us who you saw him hurt?" Emily hesitated, her throat tightening. For a moment, it seemed as though silence might return. But then Justice shifted slightly, pressing his head against her knee. The small movement grounded her. Emily exhaled and forced herself to look at the prosecutor instead of the accused. "It was Mr. Parker," she whispered. "I saw him fall. I saw." Blood. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The victim's name, spoken by the trembling lips of a child, sent shivers down the room. The defense lawyer quickly stood, his voice sharp. "Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay. This child cannot possibly be trusted to recall events with accuracy. She is clearly traumatized." But the judge raised a hand. "Overruled. The witness may continue." The defense scowled, sinking back into his seat. Emily pressed her face briefly into Justice's fur, drawing strength from the quiet presence. When she lifted her head again, there were tears in her eyes, but also determination. "I didn't want to see it," she said, her voice breaking. "I closed my eyes, but I still heard it. I heard Mr. Parker cry out. And then it was quiet. Too quiet." Gasps filled the air again. The courtroom was no longer just listening. They were living the scene through the girl's words, her raw and innocent description cutting deeper than any adult testimony ever could. The prosecutor leaned closer, her voice gentle. "Emily, do you remember what happened after that?" Emily's small body trembled. For a long moment, she couldn't answer. The memories clawed at her, threatening to drown her again. But Justice nudged her leg once more, and she took a shaky breath. "He looked right at me," she whispered. "And I thought I was next." The words hung in the air like a knife. A collective shiver ran through the audience. Even the jurors shifted uncomfortably. their pens forgotten, their eyes fixed on the child. The accused leaned forward slightly, his lips pressed in a thin line. For the first time since the trial began, his confidence cracked. Emily's testimony, fragile as it was, carried weight that couldn't be ignored. The prosecutor placed a hand over her notes, but didn't write. Her focus was on Emily alone. "But you're here today," she said softly. "You're safe now. He can't hurt you anymore. Do you know why?" Emily's hand smoothed down Justice's fur, her eyes softening as she whispered, "Because I'm not alone." The audience stirred again. Tears welled in the eyes of several jurors. Even the judge cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. The prosecutor gave a small smile. "That's right, Emily. You're not alone. You've been very brave today. You've told us things no one else could." Emily sniffled, her voice barely holding together. "I don't want him to hurt anyone else. That's why I'm talking. Because it's not fair." The courtroom was silent, stunned. In that moment, the little girl wasn't just a witness. She was a voice of truth, cutting through fear. A child showing more courage than many adults ever could. The defense lawyer rose again, desperate to regain control. "Your Honor," he barked, "this is clearly emotional manipulation. We are allowing a child to dictate the direction of a serious trial. This is a disgrace to the system." "Sit down, counselor," the judge interrupted firmly. "This court will hear her testimony." The defense's face flushed red as he sank back into his seat, his client glaring silently beside him. The prosecutor asked no more questions for the day. She knew pushing Emily further might shatter the fragile courage that had blossomed. Instead, she offered a soft nod. "Thank you, Emily. You've been incredibly brave today." The judge echoed the sentiment. "You may step down." Emily slid from the chair, her teddy bear clutched in one arm, her other hand never leaving Justice's fur. As the pair walked out of the courtroom, the audience didn't clap, they didn't dare. But every eye followed them with awe and admiration. In just a few minutes, the child had turned whispers into undeniable truth. And though the trial was far from over, one thing was clear. The little girl who entered the courtroom trembling had found her first real words of strength. The morning sun poured through the high windows of the courthouse, casting long beams of light across the wooden benches. By now, the trial had become the town's most gripping drama. Reporters stood outside at dawn, scribbling notes for their headlines. Crowds gathered in the lobby, hoping to squeeze into the gallery. Inside, the jurors took their seats with tense expressions, fully aware that the young girl's testimony would weigh heavily on their verdict. Emily entered quietly, her small frame almost swallowed by the heavy doors of the courtroom. In her left hand, she clutched her worn teddy bear, and with her right, she reached instinctively for justice. The German shepherd matched her pace perfectly, his fur brushed to a glossy shine, his dark eyes alert yet calm. Together, they crossed the polished floor like a pair who had done this 100 times before. Though everyone knew they hadn't, the room hushed as she climbed into the witness chair again. Today, she looked different, still fragile, still childlike, but something had shifted in her. She no longer hunched as deeply, no longer avoided every glance. Instead, she sat upright, her shoulders back, her tiny hand resting steadily on Justice's neck. The prosecutor stood, papers in hand, though she hardly glanced at them. "Good morning, Emily," she said warmly. Emily nodded, her lips pressing into a small, nervous smile. "Yesterday, you told us something very brave," the prosecutor continued. "You told us what you saw, even when it was frightening. Today, I'd like to ask you a little more only, if you feel ready." Justice gave a faint nudge against Emily's knee. The girl inhaled shakily and whispered, "I can." The prosecutor's tone remained gentle. "Emily, when you saw what happened, How did it make you feel? A simple question, but it struck Emily deeply. She stared at her hands, fidgeting with the teddy bear, her little fingers twisting the fabric. Then she raised her gaze slowly, first to the prosecutor, then hesitantly to the accused. Her voice trembled, but rang clear. I felt small, like I didn't matter, like no one would believe me if I told. The jurors leaned forward, their pens still. The audience held its breath. Emily blinked back tears, her words gaining force. But then I saw justice. And I remembered that night. I wasn't completely alone. Even when I was scared, even when I thought I couldn't say anything, he was here. He made me feel safe enough to tell the truth. The room grew heavier with silence. The defense attorney jumped up. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is giving a sentimental commentary, not fact. But the judge's gavel cracked sharply. Overruled, continue. Emily looked down at the dog, who hadn't moved an inch, and lifted her head again. She drew in a breath that seemed to fill her with something new, something fierce. And then came the words that no one expected. Turning her gaze straight toward the accused, she said in a louder, clearer voice than she had ever used, "You can't scare me anymore." The courtroom erupted in a collective gasp. The defense attorney sputtered, "Your Honor," but his protest drowned beneath the murmurs rippling across the room. Even the judge's gavel couldn't immediately calm the waves of shock. Emily wasn't finished. Her voice carried now with startling conviction, echoing off the courtroom walls. "You thought I would stay quiet forever, but I'm not quiet anymore. I saw what you did, and everyone knows the truth now. You can't hide it." The accused shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes narrowing, but his composure cracked. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. For the first time since the trial began, his confidence seemed to falter. The prosecutor froze, stunned by the child's courage, before finding her words again. "Emily," she asked softly, "why did you decide to speak out today, after all this time?" Emily's small voice carried with astonishing weight. "Because Mr. Parker doesn't have a voice anymore. And if I don't speak, then it's like what happened doesn't matter. But it does matter. He mattered. And the truth matters." The room fell into a reverent silence. The judge sat straighter in his chair, his expression solemn. Jurors exchanged glances, several visibly moved, their eyes glistening. The audience leaned forward, breathless. The defense attorney tried once more, his voice strained. "This is inappropriate. She's a child. She's emotional." "Counselor," the judge interrupted firmly, "sit down." The words landed like a hammer. Emily, trembling but resolute, pressed her cheek against Justice's head for a moment. Then, as if gathering the last of her courage, she looked back toward the jury. "I don't want anyone else to be hurt. That's why I'm here. Because being afraid is worse than speaking the truth." Her words, simple yet raw, struck harder than any evidence chart or forensic testimony. She wasn't just recounting facts anymore. She was declaring something larger, something moral and unshakable. She was telling the court and the world that she refused to let fear win. The prosecutor, sensing the magnitude of the moment, placed her papers on the desk and spoke quietly. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge looked at Emily with a rare softness in his stern eyes. "Thank you, young lady. You've shown remarkable bravery." As she climbed down from the witness chair, Justice rose with her, never breaking stride. The two moved together, the little girl and the steadfast dog, side by side like an unbreakable team. The spectators couldn't clap decorum, forbade it, but the hush that filled the courtroom carried something even stronger: respect. Jurors sat with pens idle, staring at the child who had just spoken more powerfully than any adult witness. The accused avoided her gaze, his once defiant posture bent slightly forward, as though her words had carved through his armor. His lawyer whispered furiously in his ear, but the man's eyes remained fixed on the table before him. Emily paused at the door, turning back for a final glance. Her lips pressed into a determined line, her hand gripping Justice's fur. And though she said nothing else, the look in her eyes carried a message louder than any words. You didn't win. I did. The doors shut behind her, leaving the courtroom in a stunned, heavy silence. And in that silence, everyone knew the trial had just shifted. The gavel struck sharply, calling the court back into order, but the echoes of Emily's words lingered in every corner of the room. You can't scare me anymore. The phrase replayed in the minds of everyone present, like a bell tolling through silence. Jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some blinked back tears. A woman in the third row dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, while a man near the back crossed his arms tightly, his jaw clenched, as though holding back a flood of emotion. The reporters scribbled furiously, already knowing tomorrow's headlines would lead with the little girl's defiance. On the prosecution side, quiet satisfaction glowed on the team's faces. They knew they had just witnessed something no cross-examination could erase. A child, raw and vulnerable, piercing through the formalities of the law with a truth that was undeniable. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was humanity. Meanwhile, the defense lawyer looked rattled. His usually sharp demeanor had dulled into frantic energy. His papers shuffled nervously, his eyes darting between the accused and the jury. The man beside him, the accused, sat hunched, his once confident posture sagging under the weight of a child's words. His eyes remained fixed on the table, refusing to meet the jurors, refusing to acknowledge the strength of the little girl who had stood against him. The judge cleared his throat, his voice steadier than the room felt. We will proceed with testimony. But even he seemed shaken, his usual authority tempered by the weight of what he had just witnessed. The jurors struggled inside the jury box. Emotions ran high. Juror number 4, a mother of 2, clutched her pen tightly, her eyes glistening. She imagined her own children in Emily's place, their small voices trembling in a courtroom, forced to face the person who had frightened them most. The thought made her chest ache. Juror number 7, a retired police officer, shifted in his seat, his stern exterior cracking. He had seen countless testimonies, had learned to separate emotion from fact, but this was different. This wasn't theatrics. It wasn't a rehearsed performance. It was a child's truth laid bare, simple and powerful. And he knew the jury would not forget it. Some jurors scribbled notes furiously, but many simply sat stunned, their pens idle. They weren't just listening, they were feeling. And feelings, once stirred, are hard to silence. The prosecution's move, the prosecutor rose again, but she didn't immediately question another witness. Instead, she paused, her gaze sweeping across the jury box, making sure the weight of Emily's words settled in fully. She knew better than to rush sometimes. Silence spoke louder than questioning. Finally, she said, the witness's testimony speaks for itself. What you saw today was not only evidence, it was courage. Courage from a child who had every reason to stay silent, yet chose to speak the truth instead. She let that linger, then sat back down, leaving her words hanging in the air like a challenge to the defense. The defense's desperation. The defense lawyer leapt to his feet. Your Honor, he began, his voice higher-pitched than usual, betraying his unease. A jury must not be swayed by sentiment. What we heard was not fact. It was a frightened child's memory, clouded by fear, influenced by external pressure, and frankly, by the presence of that animal. He jabbed a finger toward Justice, the police dog sitting calmly at Emily's side. The audience bristled. Gasps rippled through the room. The judge narrowed his eyes. "Watch your tone, counselor." But the lawyer pressed on, desperation leaking into his every word. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this dog is a manipulation tool. It is designed to soften the jury, to create sympathy for a child who cannot be relied upon for accurate recollection. I move that the testimony be stricken from the record." The judge's gavel cracked down. Motion denied. The defense lawyer's face reddened. He had expected to shake the courtroom back into doubt, but instead his protest only made him appear callous. Jurors frowned, whispering among themselves, unimpressed by his attack. Justice, unfazed, simply rested his head against Emily's knee, his calm presence silencing the chaos with more power than words ever could. The audience reacts in the gallery. Emotions ran wild. Parents clutched their children closer. Strangers whispered fiercely, exchanging glances that said, "We believe her." A woman pressed a hand to her mouth, visibly shaken. An elderly man shook his head slowly, muttering, "Out of the mouths of babes." The reporters couldn't write fast enough. Their pens scratched across paper, recording every flicker of drama, every word that could later be transformed into headlines. They knew the trial was no longer just about legal arguments. It was about the clash between innocence and intimidation, truth and denial. Emily's quiet triumph, though Emily had stepped down from the witness stand, she hadn't left the room yet. She sat quietly with Justice at her side, her teddy bear in her lap, her small body still trembling from the weight of her testimony. But there was something unmistakably different about her now. She no longer looked like the fragile, terrified child who had walked in days ago. Instead, there was a quiet strength in the way she sat, her back straight, her chin lifted slightly. She leaned into Justice, whispering something no one else could hear. The dog's tail gave a faint wag in response. Her courage radiated, unspoken but undeniable, and the courtroom felt it. The accused feels the pressure across the room. The accused shifted uneasily. His hands twisted together, his jaw clenched, his composure cracking. He had built his confidence on silence, on the belief that the child would never speak. But now she had. And worse, she had spoken with words that reached deeper than any evidence chart ever could. He muttered angrily to his lawyer, but his eyes betrayed him. They flicked nervously toward the jury, then quickly away. The weight of Emily's testimony pressed on him heavier than any cross-examination. For the first time, he looked cornered. The judge's words before adjourning for the day, the judge addressed the court directly, his voice solemn. "This trial has heard many testimonies, but today we witnessed something extraordinary. The bravery of a child is not to be dismissed. It is a reminder to all of us jurors, attorneys, and the public that truth often comes from the most unexpected voices." He paused, letting his gaze linger on the jury. "I expect you to weigh her words carefully." The gavel struck. Court adjourned. Outside the courtroom, when Emily finally emerged from the courthouse, Justice padding faithfully beside her, the crowd outside erupted into murmurs and flashing cameras. Reporters surged forward, microphones stretched toward her, questions flying. But Emily didn't answer. She only knelt down, hugging Justice tightly, burying her face into his fur. The cameras clicked furiously, capturing the moment, a fragile child clinging to the dog who had helped her find her voice. Her silence outside spoke just as loudly as her words inside. She didn't need to say more. She had already said everything that mattered. The emotional ripples of her testimony spread far beyond the courtroom that day. Strangers spoke of her courage in coffee shops. Parents told their children her story at dinner tables, and the jurors went home with heavy hearts. Unable to shake the image of the little girl who had stared fear in the eye and declared, "You can't scare me anymore." The trial was far from over. But everyone knew the defense's foundation had cracked, and the verdict, though not yet spoken, had begun to take shape in the silence that followed her testimony. The courthouse buzzed like a hive on the morning of closing arguments. The trial had stretched on for weeks, but the town, the press, and the public all knew it would be remembered not for the long list of witnesses, not for the forensic charts or police reports, but for the trembling voice of a little girl who dared to speak. The benches were filled to capacity once again. Reporters leaned forward with pens poised, knowing history was about to be written. The accused sat at his table, shoulders hunched, his lawyer whispering hurried instructions in his ear. Across the aisle, the prosecutor organized her papers with deliberate calm, though her eyes betrayed an intensity sharpened by Emily's testimony. The jurors filed in, their faces solemn. Each of them carried the burden of what they had witnessed, the echo of Emily's words still heavy in their minds. The judge struck his gavel. "Ladies and gentlemen, today you will hear the closing arguments. Afterward, the jury will be dismissed to deliberate. Let us proceed." The prosecution's closing. The prosecutor rose, her voice steady and clear. She paced slowly before the jury, her words deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have heard evidence from every angle. You have seen the physical proof, heard from the investigators, and reviewed the facts. But beyond all of this, you heard from the one witness who mattered most, the one who had nothing to gain, no agenda, no motive beyond the truth." Her eyes softened as she glanced toward the empty witness chair, where Emily had sat days earlier. You heard a little girl speak words that no child should ever have to say. You watched her summon courage in front of the man who terrified her. And you heard her say the words that cut through all the doubt. "You can't scare me anymore." The jurors shifted, some swallowing hard, others leaning forward. The prosecutor's voice grew firmer. "This case is not about sympathy, it's about justice. That child told you the truth. She told you what she saw, what she felt, and why she chose to speak. And despite her age, her words were consistent, clear, and brave. You cannot dismiss her simply because she is young. In fact, her youth makes her testimony all the more powerful because she had every reason to stay silent. Yet she chose to speak. She let the words hang, then lowered her voice. Ladies and gentlemen, the victim cannot speak for himself. But Emily spoke for him. Do not let her courage be in vain. Find the truth where she showed it to you and deliver justice." She stepped back, her closing complete. The weight of her words filled the room, and for a moment, silence reigned. The defense's last stand. The defense attorney stood next, his usual bravado dulled by exhaustion and desperation. He tugged at his tie, cleared his throat, and began pacing. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said quickly, "you have been manipulated." The words earned an immediate ripple of disapproval from the gallery. The judge struck his gavel once. The defense pressed on, his tone sharp. "You have been asked to base your verdict on the words of a frightened child, words that are emotional, inconsistent, and influenced by the presence of a dog trained to create sympathy. This case is not about feelings. It is about facts." He pointed to the jury with an almost frantic edge. "Where is the hard evidence? Where is the undeniable proof tying my client to this crime? You have none. You are being asked to convict based on sentiment alone. And if you do that, you are not upholding the law, you are destroying it." His words echoed, but they landed flat. The jurors' faces were unreadable, their pens motionless. The lawyer's voice grew harsher. Children can misremember. They can imagine. They can be led by suggestion. If you let emotion rule you, then any frightened child could condemn an innocent man. And that is not justice. He paused, waiting for reaction, but the silence that followed was not supportive. It was cold, heavy, resistant. He had played his last card, and it was clear it had fallen short. He sat down, his jaw tight, his hands trembling as he shuffled his papers. The jury withdraws. The judge addressed the courtroom. Members of the jury, you now have the responsibility to deliberate. You will weigh the evidence, the testimony, and the law. Remember your duty. Court is adjourned until a verdict is reached. The gavel struck, and the jurors filed out solemnly. Inside the deliberation room, tension hung like a storm cloud. They sat around the long table, their faces weary, their notes scattered before them. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, juror number 3 broke the silence. We all know what we just heard in there. That girl, she wasn't lying. You could feel it. Juror number 8 shook his head. We can't let feelings run the show. The defense is right. We have to look at the facts. Juror number 4, the mother of 2, leaned forward, her voice quivering with emotion. Facts? That little girl was the fact. You saw her. You heard her. Do you honestly believe she imagined everything she described? The way she shook, the way she stared straight at him? That wasn't imagination. That was truth. Juror number 7, the retired police officer, sighed heavily. I've seen liars before. I know the signs. That child wasn't lying. She was reliving it. And that man sitting at that table, he jabbed his thumb toward the door. He knew it too. You saw his face when she said it. He broke. The room buzzed with debate, but the scales were already tilting. The jurors knew Emily's words carried more weight than any exhibit in evidence. Outside the jury room, back in the courtroom, the accused paced in agitation while his lawyer tried to soothe him. The prosecutor sat silently, her hands folded, her gaze distant but calm. She knew the jury's decision would take time, but she also knew something irreversible had happened. Emily's words had carved themselves into the hearts of everyone who heard them. Emily herself waited in a quiet room nearby, Justice curled at her feet. She stroked his fur absent-mindedly, whispering, "Do you think they'll believe me?" The dog's calm eyes met hers, and though he couldn't answer, his presence was all the reassurance she needed. Hours of deliberation. The hours stretched long. The courthouse remained tense, spectators crowding the halls, reporters pacing with restless energy. Everyone knew the verdict would decide more than guilt or innocence. It would decide whether a child's courage had been enough. Inside, the jurors wrestled with details, but again and again, their conversations circled back to Emily. The defense's arguments about sentiment rang hollow compared to the raw truth they had witnessed. Finally, after hours of debate, juror number 4 placed her hand firmly on the table. "We have a duty to the victim, to justice, and to that little girl. We cannot walk out of here pretending we didn't believe her. We all know what we saw, and we all know what we heard." The others nodded slowly, agreement spreading around the table like dawn breaking over darkness. The stage is set. As evening fell, the judge's clerk received word. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled once more, tension crackling like electricity in the air. Reporters gripped their pens. Families held their breath. The accused sat rigid, his lawyer whispering desperately into his ear. Emily was not present this time. She waited quietly in the private room, justice still by her side. But even in her absence, her presence lingered. Her words echoed in every mind. "You can't scare me anymore." The judge banged the gavel. "Bring in the jury." The room fell silent as 12 solemn faces filed back into their seats. The foreperson clutched a folded piece of paper, his expression grave. The stage was set. The verdict was moments away. The courtroom had never been so still. Every cough, every shuffle, every nervous breath seemed amplified as the jury filed back in. Their faces revealed nothing, but the weight of their decision pressed down on everyone like a storm cloud ready to break. The judge nodded toward the foreperson. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson, a tall man with graying hair and tired eyes, stood. His voice wavered, though he fought to keep it steady. Yes, Your Honor, we have. The clerk approached, took the folded slip of paper, and handed it to the judge. The courtroom leaned forward collectively, as if the air itself demanded the words be spoken. The judge scanned the paper, then looked back at the jury. On the charge of aggravated assault? A pause. The defendant gripped the edge of his table so tightly his knuckles turned white. His lawyer whispered frantically, but the words went unheard. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Gasps rippled across the room, followed immediately by a heavy silence. The judge continued reading. On the charge of child endangerment guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder guilty. The courtroom erupted in whispers, sobs, and sharp intakes of breath. The defendant slumped back in his chair, his mouth hanging open, his face drained of all color. His lawyer buried his face in his hands. The judge struck his gavel. Order in the court. But order was impossible. The tide of emotions, relief, grief, triumph rolled through the gallery like a wave. Reporters scribbled furiously. Family members clutched each other, and even the bailiffs exchanged glances of relief. The prosecutor sat still for a moment, her lips pressed tightly together, then allowed herself a quiet, satisfied breath. Justice had been served. Emily's return down the hall. In the quiet waiting room, Emily sat with justice curled at her feet. She didn't know yet what the verdict was. She only knew that her heart was pounding in her small chest. The door opened, and the prosecutor stepped inside. She knelt down, so she was eye level with Emily. They believed you, she whispered softly. Emily, they believed you. Emily's eyes widened, her lips trembling. He's going to jail? The prosecutor nodded, her voice thick with emotion. For a very long time. Emily let out a shaky breath, one that seemed to carry the weight of years she should never have had to bear. She buried her face in Justice's fur, and the dog responded with a gentle nudge of his head against her shoulder, as if he understood perfectly. A judge speaks back in the courtroom. The judge turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your service. Your duty here is concluded. He then faced the convicted man. The jury has spoken. You are remanded into custody without bail. Sentencing will follow. The man was led away in chains, his once arrogant demeanor now shattered. His eyes darted around desperately, but no one returned his gaze. He had been broken, not just by the law, but by the voice of a child who refused to remain silent. The gallery waits outside the courtroom. The crowd had swelled. Cameras, microphones, and flashing lights filled the corridor. Everyone wanted to know, what would happen next? Would Emily speak again? The prosecutor hesitated, but then Emily herself made the decision. She rose to her feet, placed a small hand on Justice's head, and whispered, "Let's do it." When the door opened and Emily stepped out with Justice at her side, the crowd fell into silence. The little girl, who had stood trembling in the witness box days earlier, now stood with her shoulders straight, her chin lifted. She looked so small against the sea of reporters and cameras, but in that moment, she seemed larger than life. The final statement, a reporter shouted, "Emily, do you have anything you'd like to say?" Emily paused. Justice pressed against her leg, grounding her, steadying her. She took a deep breath, then spoke, her voice quiet but steady enough to carry through the microphones. "You all heard me in court. I told the truth. I was scared, but I wasn't alone. Justice was with me. And today, justice for the victim happened too." The crowd held its breath. Reporters jostled, cameras clicked, but not a soul interrupted. Emily swallowed hard and continued. "He tried to scare me into silence. But the truth is bigger than fear. I wanted everyone to know that. If you're scared, if someone tries to hurt you, don't let them win. Speak, because when you do, people will listen. Her eyes welled with tears, but she didn't look away from the cameras. Instead, she placed both hands on Justice's back, drawing strength from the dog who had never left her side. Today I learned something, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Monsters lose their power when you stop hiding. He doesn't scare me anymore, and he'll never hurt anyone else again. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then the crowd erupted applause, tears, shouts of encouragement. Reporters who were trained to remain detached found themselves wiping at their eyes. Strangers in the crowd called out, "You're so brave. We believe you, Emily." The prosecutor placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder, pride radiating from her face. The judge, standing at a distance, quietly nodded in approval. Even the bailiffs seemed moved, their stoic expressions softened by admiration for the little girl who had turned the trial into something unforgettable. A symbol beyond the case in the days that followed, Emily's story spread across the nation. News outlets replayed her courtroom testimony and her words outside the courthouse. Opinion pieces praised her courage, and children's advocacy groups hailed her as a symbol of resilience and truth. Justice, the police dog, became a quiet hero, as well his steady presence recognized as a lifeline for a frightened child who needed a silent companion in her darkest moment. Emily didn't seek fame. She returned to her life quietly, focusing on healing. But everywhere she went, people remembered her as the girl who faced fear head-on and reminded the world that truth, no matter how small the voice that speaks it, can shatter silence. The last scene months later, Emily and her mother sat together on their porch at sunset. Justice lay sprawled at Emily's feet, enjoying the cool evening air. Her mother looked at her, eyes full of both love and sorrow. "You changed everything, Emily. You changed lives." Emily leaned down, kissed Justice on the head, and whispered, "I just told the truth." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and crimson. Emily's words, though simple, held the power of everything she had endured and everything she had overcome. In the end, she was no longer the trembling girl on the witness stand. She was the girl who faced a police dog in court, stood against her fear, and said words that no one would ever forget. "You can't scare me anymore." And she meant it.